Oh, welcome to what? Series 12 and number 23. We're getting up there, aren't we? And this is from Acts chapter 17, and this is where Paul is in Athens. Paul sees the place of Athens as full of idols. In verse 16 of chapter 17, he says, while Paul was waiting in Athens, he was upset to see all the idols in the cities. Well, kind of what does he expect? He was distressed about it, as it says there. The King James Version of the Bible said his spirit was stirred. And the Greek version of it sort of gives the idea that he was exasperated by it. The reality is, he sensed that God isn't in these people's lives. He feels that he has to react to that in some way. Now, as a point of application, when do we get stirred up or distressed that people don't have God in their lives? When we hear a good missionary speaker or see a starving kid on television or talking to our neighbours. We need to think about that. Paul is speaking, and in its terms preaching, about foreign deity in verse 18. It says in verse 18, some of them were Epicureans and some of them were Stoics, and they started arguing with him. And people were asking, what is this know-it-all trying to say to us? Some even said, Paul must be preaching about foreign gods. That's what he means when he talks about Jesus and about people rising from the dead. Now, well, what do they expect? He's a foreigner. He doesn't have the same belief structure as them. Notice, some of them thought it was babble. We still get that reaction today. Others assumed it was something really foreign. Yep, it sure was to them. Their religions were all about the mythical gods and the creatures and about being selfish and doing bizarre things. What Paul was speaking about was God's grace. As another point of application, some people don't get it. We just keep on. Paul gives us another template here on how to do stuff. These Epicurean and Stoic philosophers are curious guys. So they asked him in verse 19, they brought Paul before a council of the Areopagus and said, tell us what your new teaching is about. We have heard you say some strange things and we want to know what you mean. More than anything else, the people of Athens and the foreigners living there loved to hear and to talk about anything new. You see, the Epicureans had a system of philosophy based on the teaching of the ancient Greek guy Epicurus, and he was around about 300 BC. His materialism led him to a general attack on superstition and divine intervention. He didn't believe that stuff. The Stoics taught that destructive emotions resulted in errors of judgment, of active relationship between, here's the term, cosmic determinism and human freedom, and the belief that it is virtuous to maintain a will. Yeah, it's all very confusing stuff in it. To live a good life, one had to understand the rules of nature in order that they were taught, and so that they could be rooted in nature and stuff like that. These guys were philosophers and thinkers and academics, and it's one of those things. Basically, they were saying, Paul, give us a lecture. They liked that kind of stuff. Again, point 3 is when people ask something, answer them. This is usually important. Too often the Christian church is trying to educate people on what it thinks people should know. But Paul and the other apostles, and particularly in Jesus' teaching himself, he answered questions in a definite style and a format for us to copy. Now there's this speech. Notice I said it's a speech. It is not a sermon. A sermon is kind of like an orientation kind of thing, whereas a speech is something that comes out which is very formal, and it followed the rules of rhetoric which they would have used in those days. Yeah, it's a formal address, and it's a discourse delivered to a specific audience. He's talking to the academics. Paul isn't treating this like he would talking to a bunch of Jews in a synagogue. He's specifically aiming it at these academic philosophers. And he has an interesting process. Firstly, he credits them as being religious. Verse 22, he says, "So Paul stood up in the middle of the council and said, 'People of Athens, I see that you are very religious. As I was going through your city and looking at things you worship, I found an altar with the words, "To the unknown God." You worship this God, but you don't really know him. So I want to tell you about him.'" You see, what happens here is Paul has found a link to be able to talk to them with credibility in their eyes as well as in Paul's eyes. The people were either looking for the unknown God, or maybe they were hedging their bets and didn't want to leave any God out. He introduces his concept of God, and he spells out the difference between their gods and his God. He sets out the requirements in how to relate to this God. It says in verse 30, "In the past, God forgave all this because people did not know what they were doing. But now he says that everyone everywhere must turn to him." Notice the translation here says, "turn to him." That is what the word repent means. Turn away from wrong and turn right. Yeah. You see, he gives proof of God's truthfulness, someone raised from the dead. He says in verse 31, "He has set a day when he will judge the world's people with fairness. He has chosen the man Jesus to do the judging for him. God has given proof of this to all of us by raising Jesus from the dead." Now they react to that. But notice Paul allows them to react. Look at verse 32. "As soon as the people heard Paul say that a man had been raised from the dead, some of them started laughing. Others said, 'We will hear you talk about this some other time.'" Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? He seems to finish with them wanting more. "We will hear you talk about this some other time." There's a second chance. There's more teaching that can be done. The other thing here that we are realistic about is some believed and some didn't. In verse 34 it says, "Some of the men put their faith in the Lord and went with Paul. One of them was a council member called Dionysius. A woman named Damaris and several others also put their faith in the Lord." Now, some believed, some didn't. What do you get out of this? Yes, there's a format for us to follow in constructing a speech or communicating about Jesus. But we do need to remember a few things. Give credit where it's due. Find a link. Introduce our concept of God. Explain what God requires, and that was the repent word. Offer the answers to their questions. Be available to talk more. And that's it in a nutshell. Bless you.